I feel like I'm by myself. Here I am, all the way down here.
I'll be right there.
Okay.
We are really lucky to have Zoeann Olson here from the Intermountain Fair Housing Council. Zoeann is a hero.
Oh, whoa, that's big word.
At helping people with discrimination problems and also sometimes gets into some, routine landlord-tenant things. So anyway,
take it away.
Okay.
So I am Zoeann Olson. I am with the Intermountain Fair Housing Council. I've been with the council about 6 years, and then prior to that, I was with Idaho Legal Aid for about 14. And my specialty is housing law. I did a little bit of consumer law, family law, senior law, just a little bit of everything. I did foreclosure and loan remediation, so kind of done a little bit of everything. And I want this to be really interactive, so at any point in time you want to ask questions or discuss something. I'm going to kind of walk through, imagine yourself as, we're doing fair housing landlord tenant, correct? Okay, so I just want to kind of walk through, imagine that you are someone looking for a rental, and just like some of the issues that pop up and how to resolve them. But most importantly, the thing that I want you to take away with today is how to know who to go to when you need resources. So Intermountain, like many of the other social service groups, we're kind of that safety net in the community. We work with all of our legal partners, with Idaho Legal Aid. I put together a resource. Does everybody have this? It's a website. I will make sure for Justice Jones, I will include phone numbers and addresses that will be circulated the next time. I just quickly put this together because I saw that was a topic of discussion for housing, so I want to make sure that we had it. If you notice on the top, it talks about fair housing, and on the bottom it talks about landlord-tenant. So Intermountain, typically in our legal group, there's Intermountain Fair Housing Council, Legal Aid, Idaho Volunteer Lawyers, Concordia. Not on here is ACLU, and some of our other legal partners, maybe immigration issues and that. We are kind of the safety net. People call in and we help with mass evictions, we help with where there's been fires or something like systemic is happening that is really tough. We have a 24-hour hotline, so you can call us. I put my phone number on here. You can also reach us by email, so there's an email on there. I've been messaged by Facebook, so email, through our website, our phone number, and Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I've been contacted all of those ways, so feel free at any time. That's like very urgent. I've been contacted at 12 at night. I've been contacted at 5 in the morning. So there's always some way to get a hold of us if there's something going on that's housing and you don't know if it's fair housing or some other type of housing issue. Okay, so just know that that's a welcome thing. Also know that we receive federal funding, so we are not a state agency. We are a private organization that is a 501c3 nonprofit. So if someone contacts us and they don't speak English, we will make sure that there is an interpreter. And I want to show that our commitment, and there may be other languages that are needed, but the people who most frequently come into our office, when we hand out these little booklets, we have it in multiple languages so that everyone knows fair housing. If you have that expertise and want to add to this, or us to create additional, I would so love it, because whatever's needed in the community, we want to make sure there are additional languages. Okay, so, but somebody calls, and we get a call in, and we will take that phone call, and if it needs an interpreter or someone is hearing impaired, or they come into our office and they need someone to sign, or someone who's an interpreter, we will access those resources. So that's the first thing, so that we understand what the housing concern is. Then the person will typically tell us about their housing issue, and it's kept confidential, and we will get all the information. And then the next step is we typically will figure out whether or not the person has been discriminated against. And primarily we address housing discrimination. That means under the Federal Fair Housing Act, under federal law, not state law or city ordinance, we look at whether the person has been discriminated against based on, and you can look at our one-sheeter here, race, color, religion or lack thereof, sex, meaning male, female, or you don't regard yourself as either male or female, national origin, disability, and familial status, or the presence of children under the age of 18. So if you come into our office, typically someone will say, I saw an ad in the newspaper, and they said they wouldn't rent to us because we had children. So they'll see an ad and it says no children, or they've walked up to a place and they see you with your children and they say, no, we're not going to rent to you, we don't take children. Then they're someone who's in a protected class. What class are they in? Why would they might be discriminated against?
Familial.
Yeah, familial status.
Yeah.
Right, that's a big word. Or family status, called family status, because of their children. So they recognize something's not right. There's no one, they go and look at the place and there's no one there that has children. Unless it's a 55 and older property, so there are some residential communities, both mobile home parks and apartment buildings that are 55 and older, where by law, under the Housing for Older Persons Act, they can actually say they won't take families with children, and it's more complicated than that, but then if it's something that we can look at. So if someone says, no, we will not rent to you because you have children, then you can call us, email us, contact us one of those ways, walk into our office, and we will do an interview. And what we have to find out is whether or not that housing provider, the person who said they wouldn't rent to you or who would not rent to you because you didn't have children, we have to find out whether or not they are covered by the Federal Fair Housing Act. That means, does the housing provider, the apartment complex, the property manager, whatever, do they have 4 or more properties? Are they engaged in the business of housing? So if it's an owner and they have 4 or more properties, they have 4 rental units, it's a big complex, they have 52 units, then if they said those things, okay, if they said, I'm not going to rent to you, Justice Jones, because you have children, and they have 4 or more complexes, then that's something, 4 or more rental units, then that's something where we'll say we have jurisdiction. We have the ability to investigate it because they fall under the law. Does that make sense? Okay. And so then we're going to ask Justice Jones, we're going to say, Justice Jones, when did that happen? When did they refuse to rent to you? And Justice Jones will say, Yesterday. And typically, if the incident happened, if they told Justice Jones yesterday that we're not going to rent to you because of your children, and it happened within a year, you can file it with HUD. And notice that's one of your resources on this. You can file with Department of Housing and Urban Development. Through us, we will help you. We are free legal services. And many of these organizations that are on here provide free legal services, and that's why this is a really good resource. You don't have to pay, okay? Or if it was 2 years ago, if Justice Jones said it was 2 years ago, or within almost 2 years, then we can file in court if he has the evidence to show that he was discriminated against. If he comes in and he has a statement and then the rules say that and he has the ad, it's probably pretty good evidence that he was discriminated against based on refusal to rent to him because he had children, okay? Sometimes things are not as obvious, and so I'm going to go through some of the obvious things or non-obvious things, and I want you to share with me if you have any experiences or any questions. But typically I've kind of made a list for myself of things. So typically through ads, it may seem fine, sometimes things people are saying, but if there are worrisome things like no pets, that's fine. But if they don't take people who have service animals, that's concerning to us, because if they fall under the Fair Housing Act, that may be discrimination. If they say things like rules that regulate children, like no fences, no toys, things that show that they're not going to allow things that would be associated with someone who has children, that might be concerning. So look for things like that. If you see an ad, or it says, females only, males only, it may be a roommate situation, and it may be okay if it's like a dorm-like setting, but it may not. So I'm just saying, if you see kind of red flags in ads, that might be concerning. The same thing with applications and rules. When you look at an application or rule, and you're just going to see if you want to rent there, you'll have to show, usually you qualify because of your income, right? So usually you have to pay like 3 times the rent. You have to pay 30% of your income for rent. So they're going to make sure that you can pay the rent, that you will qualify. Well, sometimes people with disabilities, it's very hard, or people who are in certain populations that need additional assistance, like people with disabilities may have SSI, they may have SSDI, they may have a VASH voucher, they might be a single parent with children, they might be predominantly here newly arrived. If they have that assistance and they would qualify with possibly with a co-signer or some additional income from some other source, that may be way they qualify for that 30%. And so that's another way of looking, are they being too strict with their rules because they're trying not to rent to a certain population because of their race, because of their color, because of one of these protected classes, right? So that might be something to look at. The other thing is that the government, both Department of Justice and Department of Housing and Urban Development said, we are concerned about the disproportionate incarceration of people of color and people with disabilities. And once people come out of incarceration, we're concerned that they are being screened out because of the disproportionate and severity of sentences. And so we are going to look at criminal background. And criminal background can no longer be, you can't say no convictions, no arrests. You have to be more accepting of other people that have paid their dues and come out of incarceration. So they're gonna say to us, look at things like how long ago did that felony or misdemeanor occur, right? How long did that criminal act occur? What was the nature of that crime? Did they repeat that crime at any time? So those are 3 things they're going to look at, and you need to adjust your screening, you landlord. And we have successfully worked with landlords so that we're creating more housing opportunity so that when people come out of incarceration, they are coming out successful and able to get jobs and live happier lives. So that's something that to look at as, do they have just blanket arrests or convictions? And that might be a concern because it really might mean they're screening out groups of people. The same with not taking vouchers. Does everybody know what a housing voucher is? Sometimes people who are very low income need what is called a Section 8 project-based housing choice voucher or other types of HUD subsidy, or they may have SSI or some other type of funding because of their disability or because of some other protected class. Well, sometimes landlords will have blanket policies that they don't take that assistance. But if they, again, don't allow for a cosigner or possibly other income like food stamps and other sources of child support and things that would make up that 30%, that rule may be screening out moms with kids. It may be screening out people of color. It may be screening out people with disabilities. Okay, so we've worked with landlords to make sure they have flexible and inclusive policies that don't screen out people based on protected classes or have the effect of doing so, okay? So those are the things that we kind of look up on application, and that they're transparent. People should tell you when you rent right up front. This is an example, but here's my application, here's how much it costs, here are the rules, so that you have a transparent idea of what you're signing yourself up for, right? And if you don't, you should ask them, they should have your eligibility criteria, because there also might be some consumer protection issues of concern if they're not being transparent about it. If you get denied, if someone were to get denied because of their criminal history or because of medical debt or because of some other reason, you may be able to do what's called appeal it or file a grievance. And the landlord should have a transparent policy, meaning in writing, they should say how you can appeal that decision. And they should have it in writing. Again, that is a consumer protection provision that should be in there. And if you want any of this information, I have a whole handout on it. But they should have that in the rules about how you can appeal that decision. And specifically, when someone's getting federal subsidy, if that complex is, they should give you that information because they're required to. Okay, then that you should appeal it. If I'm a person with disability and say, for 2 years I had cancer and I was going through chemotherapy and I couldn't afford it, and so I incurred some serious medical debt, I can ask for what's called a reasonable accommodation because I have a disability to overlook that medical debt, because now I've got a job, I'm able to pay my bills, I have insurance, I've had, for the past year, I've had a good rental record, things like that. So you can provide some assurance. That's something free we can do for you. We can assist you with if there is something that may be a barrier to you getting into a unit. And I want to give kudos to Marco's organization, Aleda, because they can also assist with that. They're very good at it. So we can help. Aleda can help. There might be other organizations, IVLP and some of these other Idaho Legal Aid that can help you with some of these things. But know that if there's a barrier you come up on, where are you going to go get help? Right? I mean, that's the important thing is when someone puts a block in your, someone puts a wall up, that may be a fair housing issue. Better check, right? Every time a wall gets built, let's bring it down. We're here to help you get over that wall, okay? Or find someone to help you get over that wall. Thank you, Justice Jones. Okay, so that's the kind of thing. If something comes up with the application, look. The other thing is if the housing provider receives federal funding, they are required by federal law to provide you with an interpreter for free. Okay? So if you go, and I am a Section 8 project-based housing provider, I am a USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture provider, I am the housing authority, and you come to me, I am required to provide you with an interpreter, okay? So make sure people know that. They should have on their wall what's called an I speak card, and I apologize I don't have one, I'll make sure Justice Jones gets it, but they should have something and someone can point to it and say I need that. Or if I am hearing impaired, meaning I am deaf, and I need someone to sign for me, or I need some other form of language for a person who's hearing impaired, because not everyone speaks American Sign Language. They are also required to pay for that. If they're a private provider, you can ask them for it. They typically will provide it, but they're not required to pay for it. Does that make sense? Okay.
What if somebody is handed a lease and they say, I can't read that? Can you get an interpreter to read the lease? Okay, the question, did everybody hear the question was, if they give you a lease and you don't speak English, can you ask for an interpreter? And yes, and you should. You should, absolutely. When you are looking at screening criteria, when you are looking at eligibility criteria, anything when you're applying, if you don't understand the application, you can ask them to get an interpreter, read the application, read the rules, read the screening criteria. You should read everything and don't sign it until you understand. Again, remember that wall comes up, you call someone who can get you help, okay, when you don't understand. That's another thing. So they should provide an interpreter to read through this, and then typically they will ask the interpreter to sign that they interpreted it, and they will then ask you, if they interpreted it for me, they will ask me to sign it to say. It's hard because sometimes, be cautious. What is interpreted may be not what is there. So you want to make sure that at least you get it interpreted and maybe have someone else help you look at it, okay? Because entering into a contract is a serious thing, right? Okay. The other thing is that typically on application that comes up for many families, especially families with children, but people who are trying to live either multi-generational or people with disabilities who want to live as a group, is the limit on the number of people who can live together, or what's called housing providers' occupancy policies. And typically the rule, it's called the Keating Memo, it's issued by HUD, is 2 per bedroom plus 1. And I say the plus 1 because there has been some case law, particularly in Idaho, that anyone younger than 2 is not considered it's not that they're a person, but they're not considered in counting them, right? Because families sleep together in their bed and they share. I was one of those people. Or there's some very liberal policies out of California that say anyone under 5, because a lot of families sleep all together, all the kids in one bed, and a lot of families live together multi-generational. And what we've been finding is when people go to apply, there'll be a place that has 2,000, I'm exaggerating right now, but 2,000 square feet, and a place that has 1,500 square feet, and something was happening. It was the same housing provider,
And with a place that had 2,000 square feet and three bedrooms, okay, so 2 per bedroom plus 1, so they had 7 in the family. They were being steered to the other complex that had 1,500 square feet, so the smaller one. Same prices, okay, same prices, so that wasn't an issue. Same qualifications, everything. What we noticed that there was no one at the 2,000 square foot complex, no one of color, no one. So they were actually using that policy to screen and steer people over to this other building and segregate people by race and national origin. So sometimes those policies, when they seem like they're being applied evenly, are not, because the square footage also matters. The Keating memo looks at square footage, number of bedrooms, what other bedrooms could be used as a bedroom. What is the law in that area on occupancy? So sometimes cities have occupancy policies. What are the rules written in the lease agreement? Are they being applied to everyone the same? Okay. And are they using it to screen out groups of people? Maybe it's overly restrictive because they don't want people who, there's vulnerable adults that live because of their disabilities, live together with someone who's like a caretaker. And a lot of times they're in the same unit and there'll be 3 or 4 adults and they'll say, nope, we only allow 2 adults or we only allow 3 adults. That may be discrimination based on disability. So if in doubt, remember that wall comes up? It seems like this doesn't seem right. This one's 2,000 square feet and this one's 1,500. There's something not right here. Call, because that may be a fair housing issue, just like the examples I gave you. When you move in, I'm going to share this checklist real quick. I don't have a whole bunch, but I want you to take a look at it. I'll pass these around. Please, please, please urge every single person you know to do a move-in checklist. Whether you can find these online. If the landlord does not give you one, I'll pass it down to share. If the landlord doesn't give you one, you go online, you can find like 12, you can find all these different templates, but do it yourself. If the landlord, that's also a red flag. If the landlord doesn't give you one, do it yourself, because you want to make sure that you have the move-in inspection and the move-out inspection filled out completely. And I always recommend when people move in, I'm going to show you my favorite thing. This is for everything. I have all my interpreters on my phone. I can call them up and have a conversation. But also, I photograph everything. I video everything. If I have that move-in checklist, I photograph it, I email it to myself, I have a file folder. Eleda has a wonderful class that they put all of your move-in inspections, everything you ever get from a landlord, your lease, all your receipts, and you have a file folder with all of your housing stuff in it. And you should keep that. And you should keep every single thing you ever get from your landlord and everything that you give to your landlord. It should be in this file. So when you're moving in, you take that picture, you fill it out. If you don't agree with that inspection, then you should note that you disagree with the condition. Or if you see something and the housing provider doesn't see it, there was a red stain in the carpet in the upstairs bedroom, then you should note that. And you should take a picture. You should go by room and you should video, it's better to video record it and take a picture, but at least have either a document in writing with the pictures or the video so you can document your move-in inspection. Because at the end, when you move out, you're going to also document it. Okay? So on move-in, it's really important, because what Justice Jones and many of our colleagues are finding is that disproportionately and concerning are both people with disabilities and people of color being charged with higher damages than people who are not in those protected classes. And that's concerning, because we're concerned either people are getting taken advantage of, or possibly repairs aren't being done, or they're overinflating charges. So we want to make sure that you have that, because that's your best documentation, your move in and your move out, plus the video. And not everybody's doing this, so I'm not trying to scare you, but concerning that we have a number of cases and all of our legal groups. So it's very important when you move in to have that done. The other thing is, when you sign a lease, make sure, like Justice Jones said, make sure you understand it. If you don't understand it, get help, but make sure you understand every term and condition. The number one issue that I had when I worked at Legal Aid and at Fair Housing is people, if you can't pay rent, contact us, because we have a huge number of resources to help people with paying rent. If you dispute the amount you owe, contact us and contact Legal Aid and contact anybody in Concordia, because we can help with those issues and we know resources. But it's very important when you get an eviction notice, when you get any notice from your landlord asking you to do something, to contact someone for help. Don't wait, right? Because the rule is very quick. It's 3-day notice for non-payment of rent. It's 3-day notice in writing if you violate a rule. There's all these notices that may pop up and you need to contact someone right away. And if they're a federally funded complex, again, what should they do with that notice if it's not in your language?
Translate it.
They should translate it, or they should interpret it, right? Translation may not be required, but interpretation always is. If it is a critical document, if I give you a notice that I am giving you a 3-day notice for non-payment of rent, I may not be required unless it's in Spanish. And Spanish is probably the only majority language in the state that would qualify for translation, but it must be interpreted. We do it because we have so much interaction with people who speak different languages. Just for us, it is easier and better service, better customer service. So typically, repairs are probably the number one thing that we hear about that people need assistance with. And if you need a repair, we can help you get the information. It's online at www.idaholegalaid.org. Concordia can help, but you can request a 3-day demand for repair in writing. And Legal Aid has a wonderful self-help fill out. That's something we can do. That's something Concordia can do. I'm sure Justice Jones' group can help with that. All of us can help with that, and they have to comply within those 3 days. And that's 3 business days. And if they don't, then you have the right to pursue it in court. Sometimes people have disabilities that if that repair isn't made, it is a threat to their disabling condition, okay? So that's another step where Intermountain, our organization, can come in and ask for what's called a reasonable accommodation to have that repair done quickly. Because sometimes it is life or death whether a repair is done. And it's because of your disabling condition. And if the landlord refuses, or the housing provider or housing program refuses, then we can address it through, hopefully we can mediate it, but if we can't, then we can enforce it through specific performance. We can go to court and get it enforced, okay? But I just want you to know that's another resource. If that barrier, that wall comes up, will help you bring it back down. The other issue that we typically see with fair housing and kind of landlord-tenant is harassment. What does that mean? We've had a number of cases where people are moved in, and I'll just give you an example. The next door neighbor comes over and says, I don't like you because you're from this country, or I don't like you because you're this religion, or I don't like you because whatever, you have kids. And they've said that, they make that statement, and then they continue to harass that person. Or they call the police, and make those statements. Or they report it to the landlord. The landlord should investigate that. Best practices, the landlord should come interview you, interview the person who complained, and evaluate the evidence. The landlord should also ask other tenants, did you hear, so-and-so noisy last night, because we're having complaints about noise from this area of the apartment complex. And they should interview everyone and then evaluate it. And if that happens, typically it gets sorted out, okay? But in many times they take the one person's story, they complain about them, they take the one person who complained, and I'll give you the example from a case. They said, oh, that family, they went over to the husband and wife, and they didn't think they spoke English very well, and they said, we don't like you because you're black. And they said that, and the tenant understood it well enough and said, I'm going to go report this. And she went to the landlord and said, my neighbor said this to me, please move me. And the landlord didn't move her. And they proceeded to call the police on them regularly. And thank goodness for the police, because the police documented that there was nothing. One time they complained because they said they had their radio and TV on. And the police in their report show they had no radio, they had no TV at the time. The next time, the lady had just had her baby. And the husband was with her at the hospital. And again, they reported it, and had the landlord investigated it, what would the landlord have found? They weren't even there at the time. The next time, she was with a friend with her baby, staying over while the husband worked. So had the landlord investigated it, they would have found that that they were harassing them because of their race and national origin. They were discriminating. And we went to court, and we prevailed. And those are the things that I tell you because it's so serious that no one should have to go through that. The Fair Housing Act is there to provide equitable and best treatment. We all need housing. Housing's like our refuge. It makes us safe. And if we're not safe, and we don't have access to education and health and work and everything that makes us fulfill our American dream, it's not right. Yeah.
What'd you get as a remedy in that case?
We have damages for them and another family that they were also being harassed. They had to go to training. They had to change their policy. So they had to have an anti-discrimination. The landlord had to have an anti-discrimination and fair housing policy. They had to have an anti-harassment policy. They had to be monitored for 3 years. They also paid our damages. They paid attorneys.
How did you calculate damages?
We charge on our consulting rate. So our attorney, we have an attorney we consult on, we charge on our attorney rate. So,
Okay.
yeah.
So is there any consequence for the perpetrator?
They have a fair housing complaint. They've had to pay that. They have to do that, those things. In some cases, they'll have punitive damages. In one, it was like $75,000. So it can be even higher. There was a sexual harassment case in Oklahoma, $800,000.
Does Joe Carson know what you're doing?
Pardon? Does Joe Carson? Ben Carson.
Ben Carson.
Oh yeah, we have funding from HUD. Yeah.
He's okay with it?
They gave us money. Yeah. So we're grateful. We're grateful, HUD. Yeah, I think the important part is that people need to know, it is very expensive if you violate the law, but you're also then going to have to be monitored by the court or monitored by HUD for a long period of time to make sure you don't discriminate, that you have a compliant fair housing policy, that you don't do the thing that you did before, whether it's forms, whether it's rules, that you have things in place. Sometimes we require they go through diversity training, sensitivity training, anti-oppression training. Whatever makes them better landlords for the long run is better for the community because they provide a valuable resource. We just want people not to be discriminated against and not to be, harassed or hurt. So that was a great question.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Most of the time, we don't have a proof. They don't say, I'm not renting to a refugee. Like one time I want to call because we had really many cases and we all had to help, and I'm calling from Agency for New Americans.
Mm-hmm.
We have a family of this number. Okay, fill out and we will let you know. And then I went and they saw the names on application. They said, sorry, they're not qualified. And I said, based on what? They don't have income. I provide agency paper that your lease is 6 months. And here we have 6 months rent. And the letter we say, agency is providing, and here we pay utility. And they have to have an income, but they don't say refugee. This is our policy, 3 times more than the rent. But this is their income, your rent will be paid now. And some other places, they don't even say we don't have available. Your background then go through. Refugees go all through backgrounds and background come through. So they don't say, they're very clever, so there is really no proof. Mm-hmm. And then I went one time, luckily one of the weekend, to one of our clients' apartment to introduce a volunteer to them, and they were all freezing. It was December before Christmas, and I'm like, what's going on? They said, it's all week. And then you call any number? Do you have case manager told you what? They showed me on the fridge that they called. So I said, give me the number, and I called. Nobody answered. I left a message, and what I said, this family doesn't have heat for a week, and and they have small children, and I'm calling fair housing
Good.
if you guys don't show up. In 10 minutes, somebody came and brought the space heater. I'm like, what's wrong with the heating system? Oh, the furnace we ordered. I'm like, why you didn't bring the space heater before? You see the small children and they're freezing,
Yeah.
and they're new in the country, and they were quiet. So stuff like that, when you don't have proof, like you don't have always a what do you call it, recorder, you know,
Yeah.
to get their voices. So that's the biggest challenge for us, because we don't have proof. They don't say we don't rent to refugee, they don't say we don't rent to Muslims, but just they say we don't have available unit.
So when you feel like the wall's being put up and you think you don't have proof, we are a one-party consent state, so you can tape record. There's a tape record provision. I mean, there's an app on your phone typically that allows you to tape record it. And you're right, sometimes they don't say things like that. So one thing that we can do is we do what's called testing or secret shopping. So if you come to us and say, hey, sometimes we have been told by agencies who the housing providers are that we'll call them up and they'll say, yeah, we don't take refugees. And then we can get two people similarly situated that have either not been out of mom and dad's house very long, or people who are similar coming out of some sort of institutional situation, and see how they treat both similarly situated. And we usually do it based on whatever the protected class, whether it's religion or race. And they will both wear tape recorders, and everybody knows this. And they will tape record it, and they'll see if they're being treated the same. And we do it multiple times. Sometimes it's on the phone, sometimes it's via email, sometimes it's in person. And more than not, they are caught if they're doing it. And it corroborates your allegation. You think you don't have evidence, and then you have it. Or silly, sometimes they put a whole thing. We have some really good researchers, and they put rules on their webpage, or they have posted something. We've had where they posted stuff on Facebook where they've said, you know, they've had a Confederate flag, and then they say stuff like, we don't take any refugees, you know, or they have this whole discussion group among all of their agents, and you're like, thank you, you know, this will be nice. We'll just copy. So people don't understand that we look where you think there isn't evidence. Remember, that wall's up. We're going to try to see if there is any, because we have had where a person recorded, one of the refugee agencies' staff recorded it, and they had to pay for the discrimination. So sometimes you don't think you have it, but if you need to work through some of that, we're here as a resource. You know, people are here to help. So, because if we want to take this serious, and we also, it's not, sometimes people say, oh, well, you're, you know, it's like a gotcha. Well, it isn't. It's there. We got to make sure that what you're telling us is the truth. It's gone all the way to Supreme Court. They said people can test. They said people, you know, they've allowed this kind of corroboration of evidence, because we want to make sure that what people are saying is the truth, you know. Okay. Does that help a little bit? Okay.
And another issue is
Yeah.
with kids that I hear, because I'm not a case manager, but I hear in our staff meeting, we have a family that they rent 2 units because they're large, the parents with all children under 18, because of the rule of occupancy, so 2 apartments, and the neighbors complain that the kids make noise. We have seen an experience with those kids, all of us, like, it's not true, but you cannot make the kids, and especially with these apartments, because they're very old and wooden, when they
Yes.
walk, it make noise. So poor them, they're everybody, and they said, what can I do with my kid? Not to walk, not to go to restroom,
Right.
not to go to another room, but that neighbor is complaining. So the case manager, I think, is trying to figure out what to do, but this is happening always. But even if it's refugee kid or a person who is born here, kids are kids.
Yes.
But why you complain about refugee kid? And we see in that particular complex, all the kids are outside playing,
Right.
but it's always in that particular group, and especially now for last 2 years, it's getting worse on refugees.
If you heard that, if she said, we're all pretending we're working Intermountain, if we heard her and she said this to us, what bases may be the landlord discriminating against the family based on
Familial status.
familial status? Thank you, back there, you're awesome. Because they may be overly restrictive. It may be valid, but it might not be. There's some tolerances in, you know, apartment living where it's not going to be the same level as if you lived in a separate house, right, apart from one another. And sometimes the way the house is designed, everything is amplified, everything is loud. lots of times we get mediators involved, or we have people on staff that are mediators, because there might be somebody who has a disabling condition and can't tolerate noise. I mean, it just is because of their disability. And then you have a family and they both dislike each other, and they're just being kids, and they're just having to endure on a daily basis their disabling condition. And you need somebody to go in and mediate. The landlord needs to investigate that equally and fairly. And we've had landlords where they said, yeah, we know it was designed poorly, and that guy complained about the last family with kids, and we evicted them too. I mean, they just are so just telling us that they're overly restrictive on children, or they're treating two situations, they're favoring this person over the family with children. And if nobody can ever rent there with their children, that's a red flag. Or if they're always evicting the families with children, that's a red flag. That may be discrimination, probably is, based on families with children. So if you're noticing those patterns, it might be an educational opportunity to say, hey, I'm concerned that this seems maybe too restrictive. If they don't, let the children, if the rules say, or they overly enforce having the children with the balls outside, or the children in the pool, or the children this, but adults can do whatever they want, and adults can have their skateboards out and their bikes out. And if they're treating those two groups differently, then they're basically denying families with children housing. And so that's that wall being put up, right? The wall's being put up, and we're here to try to level that. I always encourage everyone to try to resolve it themselves. Get these things. Give them. We have a familial status pamphlet. Give it to them and say, hey, I'm concerned that maybe this is overly restrictive with children. Document it. Always document things. If you're interfacing with the landlord, or the landlord's interfacing with you, they should give you everything in writing. If they're giving you a notice, if they're going to do inspections, if they're asking you for rent, you should get a receipt after you pay it. Everything should be documented. If you get any kind of court notice, it should be documented in writing, and you should document that. So those things should be in writing. Always get those things. But if you don't get those things, if they don't give you a receipt, you document it. Have a log, put it in your folder, type it in your notes. I always type things in my notes, and I save it in a folder on my phone. I email it to myself, and I have it, in my file, whether it's my personal stuff or at work. So make sure it's documented. These are your friends, so that if you ever need this information, you have it, because that's really important. Okay, I think the last thing, how are we on time? I think the last thing to remember is we kind of have move out issues, whether you're being evicted or you're choosing to move out. Again, if the landlord's terminating your lease, or they're evicting for noise or some of these things, they have to give you notice in writing. And if you don't speak English or you're hearing impaired, they have to give someone to interpret, okay? That is a must. Well, especially if they're federally funded, they must for people who are limited English proficient. Someone who's hearing impaired, they always must give a sign language interpreter or whomever, whatever kind of communication they need. Yes, sorry.
So I do case management, and I always see notices for things, but I never see anybody coming to interpret. So I wonder, do you have to go ask to the landlord for an interpreter, or should they come when they bring the notice to your house? When does the interpreter show up?
So it's if the person receives federal funding, it's best practice to say, do you need an interpreter? What is your preferred language? So if someone comes into our office, I say, even if I know you speak English really well, and I do an intake for Justice Jones, I say, and what is your preferred language? And Justice Jones will tell me English, right? But if the person comes back to me and they say Spanish, they say Kinyarwanda, they say Swahili, they say Arabic, right? Then I call them up, go on the language line, have people come in, I have people on staff that work with us that speak multiple languages, then they will provide that interpreter. So best practices, that should be how that interaction goes. But if the person, they don't offer that, make sure you ask. Encourage people to self-advocate, because they should be doing it, and that's best practice. But if they're not, and you're always initiating it, that may be something where we or your organization can help educate the landlord about that. Because a lot of times, they don't know. Gary Haynes LLC has the best website for all the language services and apps and voicing interpreters and resources. So I just suggest that because it's really, really super helpful. So that's a great question. just on move out, make sure you guys, they move out and they walk through that checklist and they take pictures. And if there's an eviction involved, that they get help right away. They're required to give notice. They're required to give what's called a summons. Justice Jones and I will make sure we get copies of that to show everybody. But make sure all that's documented. And typically 21 days or 30 days after someone moves out, they should get their security deposit back. But remember, we talked about, we're seeing a lot of discrimination and overcharging for damages, and it's concerning, or non-return of security deposits. And typically it's people with disabilities or people of color that are not getting those things back, or are being treated differently. So when in doubt, something doesn't seem right, you're not getting that deposit back, you're getting a huge debt collection bill with lots of damages, contact us or contact one of these resources. We will make sure we are all in the loop about making sure we get you to help to do the best job that we can, okay? Or contact Justice Jones, and he will also make sure we do it, okay? I don't know if we have time. I was going to do some scenarios, but if we don't have time, let's just open it up to questions. Is that
Yeah,
sound
probably
good?
should
Or,
open
yeah.
it up, and I think we have
time?
a quick
Oh, yeah.
little business meeting.
Yes, of course.
So if you had a question for Zoeann, speak now.
So I had a question about
Yeah.
single moms and how I've heard that when they show up to rent, sometimes they don't want to rent to them because there's not a man in their apartment to take care of little tiny things.
And that would be discriminate. These are great examples. So what would that be? If someone shows up and it's a mom with kids, and they say they don't want to rent to them because they don't have a man,
That's
Familiar.
sex discrimination and familial status, right?
Yeah.
These are like fair housing experts. Yeah, so that's something where you can educate them and say, well, under the Fair Housing Act, I have equal right to rent, despite me not having a husband or a male partner. I mean, if you're in the city of Boise and they discriminate, it also might be discrimination, if your partner's female, based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The Smith case in Colorado, they prevailed based on sexual orientation and gender identity in a fair housing lawsuit in federal court, because the landlord treated them differently because they weren't a traditional couple. So they refused to rent them after they met the couple. The woman was transgender female. She was married to another female, and the landlord said, oh yeah, we'll rent to you. And then she met them and she said, no, I'm sorry, you're too unique. Your family's too unique, and I'm not gonna rent you. And she said a lot of other things that made really good evidence. And the court ruled in the family's favor. They said it was discrimination based on sex because of who they associated with, that you can choose to be whomever you want to be and not fit into sexual stereotypes. So.
And why do they have to have a man when the landlord is supposed to
Right.
repair things? Unless the family is very well known to destroy everything, then it can be different. But if the landlord is supposed to be fixed things when things break, under normal quarantine.
I understand. I've been dealing with single moms for the past 4 years, and just one of the things I've heard, especially since coming here,
Yeah.
these meetings.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, it's important they, just like Marco said, is, they have obligations of things to make sure your house is habitable. And I think one of the best resources on here is the Idaho Attorney General's office website. There's like a checklist of everything that's normal wear and tear and things that are like damage and things to look at. And so if you look at it, and legal aid's website on repairs and damages is really good. Because I know that if we get these cases, we deal with them very assertively because people overcharge. I had one time where they didn't even make the repair, they just charged my client for it. And they didn't know that I knew the family who came in. And then the move inspection, the client filled it out correctly, and then they switched something else in, and he had a copy of it. And the same big old, and I'm going back to the red stain, but the same old big red stain was still there, and they said they had put in new carpet, and they hadn't. So see, there are things that you need to check, because that's why it's good for you all and all of us to educate. And hopefully this you'll go and be like a mutual aid network, and you'll get this information out, and we'll all be for housing experts, and then you'll teach the next person, and then the next person will teach the next person, so that we all know, like what our rights and obligations are. So, yeah.
If a landlord goes bankrupt, what happens in that case?
So if the landlord goes bankrupt, well, first of all, meaning it's been, they're no longer the landlord, or?
They would be, let's just say they just go bankrupt. And so therefore they own the property, but somebody goes into receivership or something like that.
Okay, so typically, I usually they will send up some kind of trust account to collect the rent, because they want to use the rent to pay the mortgage, the debt, whatever it is. If in doubt, if it were me and I was a tenant, I would get something in writing from the landlord that says, or I would write it up myself saying, who do I pay rent to? Who do I pay rent to? And will it be applied to whomever is owed the money? Because my concern is a lot of times the landlord is no longer the person who should receive the money, and we send these demand letters by certified mail, and the landlord should tell you. And otherwise, you want to keep it in some account saying, I'm trying to tender it. I'm going to tender it, but I need to know who the money is owed to. I would go down to the court, the bankruptcy court, and I would ask them. Or I would go down to land records and I would ask them, because we've had foreclosures where the landlord went in foreclosure and the new owner actually was to whom the rent was owed. Does that make sense?
Complicated
Yeah.
situation.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Expanding on that, if
Yeah.
the utility bills goes to the landlord, and then the renter is the one who is basically is threatened to shut down the utility, but they have no rights to pay for the utility bills. That what just happened. Like I said, that we live right next to this Paradigm Property Management, and we just basically ended up talking to their clients coming in, and then one of the questions we got was this one. Now they cannot pay for the rent,
okay.
and then the property management company is gone, and then they're the one who's supposed to pay the bill, but they can't. And then these people are willing to pay the bill, but they can't because they don't have a right to pay.
So the property, so it does Paradigm, or sorry, take that out.
Yes, sorry.
The property management company, they're in bankruptcy.
Yes, basically.
Is there still an owner
Well, they're
of the
not in
property?
bankruptcy, they're in a lawsuit.
They're in a lawsuit,
lawsuit.
but the owner cannot be reached.
What is that
Okay.
situation?
Extremely rare case, yes.
Yes. I would have somebody go in so that we can find out who the rent is owed to, and everybody should keep that rent and not spend it. I would strongly urge someone to send a demand letter in writing for each and every one of those tenants to ask who the rent is owed to, and not spend it. They need to have it in an account and not spent. Okay.
To go into an escrow
Certified mail,
account.
yes, an escrow account, because they want to show that they're willing to tender it, they just don't know who to tender it to, right? The same for the utilities, is if the utility company, they probably also have a case against either the landlord or the owner, if they're getting their utility shut off or repairs aren't being done or any of those things, because they have contracts. They may be, if they're injured by it or the property is injured by it, they may have a tort claim. There may be other causes of action. So it's really important. Remember that wall just got put right up? Like we're like having this big barrier, whether it's landlord, tenant, or fair housing. They need to get someone to go in and help them contact both the property manager and the owner to find out where is rent owed, who is owed, where do we pay the utilities.
Really.
Yeah, and the utilities typically, the utility companies sometimes will let you put it in your name so they don't shut it off. They've been actually really kind. I don't know about anybody's bad experience, but when we've contacted and they're like, okay, yeah, we'll keep it on until we get this sorted out. But if it's the landlord's responsibility, the landlord better be paying that utility bill. they better be paying it too. If it's the property manager, the owner, they should be paying it. You tender it to them, they should be paying it to the utility company. If that's not happening, again, a demand letter. So, certified no, by
Thank
somebody
you.
like somebody who will help you. Yeah. Marcos.
You mentioned about when a landlord, especially in certain people like 55 and older,
Mm-hmm.
and suddenly a family with children wanted to rent there, the landlord is able to say, no, we cannot rent it to you?
If
Or-
they are legally, so the question was, if they're a legal 55 and older property, sometimes they're 60 and older, sometimes they're 62 and older. And those are like, sometimes they're federal housing, where they get money from the federal government and they legally only can rent to people who are that age. 55 and older, they have to have been started. If I design a mobile home park, if I build, a residential community or patio homes or whatever, and I have to start out as 55 and older. I can't already have a complex or already have a mobile home park and evict all the families with kids
Oh,
to
okay.
become 55 and older. From the very time you start that community, apartment building, whatever, you have to start 55 and older. And you have to establish that one person out of 80% of the tenants or 80% of the homeowners are 55 or older, okay? You have to show that, and you have to do a survey every year and go around and make sure there are 80%, one in each of the 80% of the households that is 55 and older.
So-
And if you dip below that, let's say you go from 80% to it's 50-50, like you let in 50% are families with kids or younger, younger than 55, then you probably have lost that, you've probably lost that protection, okay? So that's when the problem happens is,
So same thing happened for a landlord who specializes on SOs, sex offenders.
sex offenders?
And also, and suddenly there is a unit available and a family wanted to rent.
Uh-huh.
So,
And they don't rent to because there's a sex offender there?
but no, there are already sex offenders there.
Oh, okay.
Only there are sex offenders, but a family with children wanted to come and rent too.
Oh, okay.
And they don't care about it.
The family doesn't care.
Doesn't care about it.
Right. I think the only time I think unless the law prohibits the sex offenders from being near families with children,
We should.
or the landlord, I don't think there's no prohibition. You can correct me, that's not my area of expertise, but
Yeah, I think sex offenders are prohibited from living
next to children, yeah. Well, depending
But-
on what type, right?
But if they already the sex offenders, there are already some sex offenders living there.
So they're
And they're gonna
pre-existing.
they are in the area.
I think they're subject to prosecution.
Yeah, I think they may have to
Sex
move.
offenders are.
That's a tough one. Yeah.
Subject to prosecution. Why?
Well, most of them have a limitation on how close they
Yeah.
can be to families. The
Yes.
sex offenders, that's, the judgment of the court says you cannot live within, 100 yards of a family.
Mm-hmm.
For children, yeah.
So if the family moves in, the sex offenders have to move out.
But if the sex offender they've been living there already for years.
We're talking about criminal law
Yeah.
now.
You got an intersection of criminal and civil law, is what Justice Jones is saying.
If the criminal law says that the sex offender can't live within, X number, sex offenders can't live within X number of meters of a school. And a lot of the judgments require that a sex offender cannot live within X number of meters of a family.
Mm-hmm.
So if the family moves in, if these sex offenders keep living there, they either have to move or they're subject to violation of their probation.
Right.
But isn't it the PO is supposed to approve that?
You can't get the sex offender out of hot water if a family moves in.
So where are we supposed
The
to?
family can move in. That's
Yeah.
no problem.
Where are we supposed to house the sex offenders?
In some cities, they live under bridges.
But not here,
Not here in
In
Boise.
some cities,
But we
They
had,
are
there is a
almost-
problem here in Boise.
Yeah.
It's a problem, and we need to fix that problem
Well,
because we
but-
need.
But he's saying legally,
Mhm.
let's say, so here, it's a good example. Say this landlord, okay, this is a house, and they have the person who has a criminal conviction for a sex offense.
Already, they've
and
been
they're
li-
on probation.
They've
okay?
been living there.
Yeah, and the landlord, this is good, like a law school question. And the landlord wants to comply with fair housing, okay? So they can't discriminate by excluding them, so they have to let them move in, okay? They typically
So-
don't have to reveal that there's a person with a sex
Yeah.
offender living there.
So-
I don't think they have any obligation to do that. You can like check Google that right now. But the sex offender, as term of his conviction or his probation, cannot live next to, and Justice Jones is right, next to, within a certain feet of a family. So once that happens, the probation officer will say, you must do this by this time. You must move out by this time because now you're next to the family, you're next to children. And then usually the probation officer and the landlord will work with them, and they're very good about doing that. And we need to make sure, I agree with you, Marco, so we need to make sure that people are housed.
Yeah.
People
They need to-
people who have any
They
type
are
of criminal
human
conviction.
beings too.
Right.
Mhm.
Well, and the thing is, that's why the HUD guidance came out, is that
Mhm.
people who are unhoused are more likely to reoffend, to become very sick, all of those things. So people need to be housed and housed well, housed habitably, housed with, good, that affordably and all of that. So yes, we need, and I think everybody in the community is totally on par with, we need to make sure that we communicate with one another about resources for housing people.
Yeah.
So if that situation happens, because we don't want them to have to go back in into prison.
Yeah.
And so, but they also then, the landlord's in a pickle because the landlord's not, enforcing criminal law. That is that person's sentence. And so that's, criminal justice reform or something. And I think it's going to depend on the nature and severity of the sex offense as well, So they can't be near children. There's probably a reason, although it could be, you need to look at that. But also the landlord can't discriminate against families with children and not allow them to move in because then they might be sued under fair housing.
So that will be up to the family.
It is not up to the family.
It-
The landlord, if
The landlord can say, there are sex offenders living in this building, in this
I
area.
don't think they can typically let them know. I don't think they have
allowed
any
to.
obligation to tell you. What happens is usually families, they go and look. They go look online to see, are there any sex offenders in this neighborhood? And they self-select not to move in. But the landlord has no obligation to tell personal confidential information of their tenants.
So, but then if we find that
But-
the sex offender just happened to live right next to me and I have children living in my house, then
Right.
could we ask landlord to evict this sex offender?
Mm.
I don't know. I mean, the problem is going to be.
Or do we need to move?
You probably could.
No, the family
Well, you
don't.
probably could, but if they're not in violation of their probation,
Exactly.
then they're not going to make a move because they also have a contract,
Exactly.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Unless it was something, typically the criminal law will take care of that. The probation and parole will take care of whether or not that person can live next to you. You can certainly go to them and say, I have a concern that I'm living next to
Yeah.
someone and I'm raising that concern, please document it. But just note that if probation and parole if that is not part of their sentence, or, as Justice Jones said, then buyer beware. That's just something, we need to house people who have
Exactly.
committed
to
felonies
have
and misdemeanors and all,
Mhm.
have come out of,
There is not enough bridges.
institutions. I
Just in
mean,
your-
whether it's a mental institution or incarceration or, whatever, people need to be housed, otherwise
Yes.
it's a larger cost on society to have people.
That's very
It's more
true.
expensive to institutionalize people,
Then.
whether it's a shelter,
House the people,
yeah, than it is to house them. People, there's less crime, it's
Exactly.
better for the community. So I think you want to also be careful when you report things that it's not reported in a discriminatory manner. Not to say that would be at all, but that be careful, unless they do something, then you do something. If they don't do something,
Leave
they
it
might be
alone.
on their best behavior,
Leave it alone.
Yeah.
There should be, you should be able to find out what the restrictions are on a person. There's a sex offender registry that's maintained by the state. You can go online and find out where they live and what the restrictions are on them. And, you know, if the restrictions say they can't live within a certain distance of families, then, you know.
And that's what I was saying, because I mean, normally, the POs, before the sex offender move in, the POs go and see the place. And if the PO approve, so they are okay.
Right.
I mean, they are not the one, they cannot decide anything. They are very limited in things how to do. They cannot go to yard sales, they cannot have visitors overnight, they cannot have internet, they cannot have this, on and on and on. And so when they already living there, and they have contract, and then a family trying to come in and live there.
Now, if a family wants to move in there, they probably can. There's no restriction on that. But it might violate the probation rules that the sex offender has, and he could get into trouble and have to go back to prison. So
I need to learn more about that, because I mean,
Yeah.
I
Well,
think the
it's-
sex offender should tell the probation officer that a family moved here, what can I do now?
Yes.
That's not also his fault.
In fact,
Yeah.
in fact, there's probably some requirement that you do tell.
You
Just
report
also
the
realize that
changes.
federal law, Fair Housing Act,
hmm.
for the landlord supersedes this, okay? So they have to let that family in. And the criminal, that is a different, that's civil, sometimes it's criminal if it's a hate crime, which the Fair Housing Act has a provision for hate crimes. But realize, Marcos, they got a criminal sentence, you know, they're on probation, they have to do what they're said they're supposed to do. And one of the things probably is reporting, hey, a family moved in, you know, can I get 30 days to move out? And usually the probation officers are really good with working with them on this and telling them that they will. I agree with you. But I don't know that, I think it's a matter of being proactive and going out in the community and educating about we need more resources for people who have been incarcerated.
Did I misunderstand that says that the landlord is not supposed to tell the family about the the sex offender?
I think
because
it's a confidential information, and I don't think there's any, they can call the sheriff's office. Last time I called, but you can Google it. I mean, I would call and verify this information.
Okay.
I don't think there's any, what I'm saying is legal obligation to tell.
Okay.
If I were a landlord, I would not share confidential information. If somebody comes to me and says, why does that someone have a dog? We're a no pets complex. I'd say, you know, I'm a landlord, I'm complying with state and federal law. I'm sorry, but I can't disclose information. It's confidential, just like you wouldn't want your information disclosed. I can't discuss tenants, confidential information.
Okay. Okay. Good.
I think that's how it should go. That's my opinion. So, yeah, you had a question. And then we have business.
Well, I think
I'm taking over business. Sorry.
that the rules under the Fair Housing Act don't mandate content in the lease. This subject could easily be addressed in the lease.
It could be. And I think,
The rules don't require it.
well, let's say it says in there, if someone, I'm being superficial here, but let's say it says, if someone moves in and they're a sex offender and a family wants to rent there, and it said something like, we won't rent to you because you have kids, that would be discriminatory, right? So it does, in a sense, like you can't have things in your lease that might be discriminatory. Does that make sense? So you want to make sure.
Well, I don't want anybody to
Okay.
guess. I was just wondering whether.
No, I'm not saying you do.
objectively whether.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of times some of the best information that we get on cases are, like the lease will say, adult swim hours 3 to 5. What does that mean? What do adult swim hours mean to you? Kids can't swim at that time, right? They really want to say lap swimming. They really want to say during 3 to 5, we're going to have lap swimming because they think that kids don't engage it. My child's a really good swimmer, and ever since she was like itty bitty, she's been competitive swimming. So really what they wanted to say was, you know, lap swimming from 3 to 5, or, you know, tennis games from 4 to 6, you know, active play or whatever, so that it's not kids don't get to go play on the tennis courts from 4 to 6 or something like that. So that's typically what it says. And a lot of times people will have fair housing provisions in their lease that say, you know, we comply with the Federal Fair Housing Act, we allow reasonable accommodations for, you know, people with disabilities, please ask if you need help, or those types of things. Or they'll have, you know, usually they'll have the little house that's on here, on the back of this, or it's a bitty, and they'll have, you know, someone to show that it's accessible with a person with a wheelchair. Is it required? No, but it gives you a sign that they're friendly, they're fair housing friendly. So that's just best practice. But you're right, it doesn't per se dictate unless they're a federally regulated program. Then you'll see like the housing authorities, different housing programs will require it. So, sorry, we're into your business time.
Oh, we'll
Your
just
business
wrap it up
time.
real quick. Well, thanks a
Hey,
lot,
thank you
Zoeann.
too. That's great
I sure
questions.
appreciate it.
Yeah, if you have any questions, call. I'll call you all.
I'll make this very short. I think that what I wanted to talk about was pretty much what was in the meeting.